just going to...
Yep. Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. From One King West Hotel in downtown Toronto, welcome to the Empire Club of Canada. For those of you just joining us through either our webcast or our podcast, welcome to the meeting. Before our distinguished speakers introduced today, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our head table guests. I would ask each guest to rise for a brief moment and be seated as your name is called, and I'd ask the audience to refrain from applause until everyone has been introduced. So our head table guests are the Right Honourable Paul Martin, former Prime Minister of Canada, Mr. Jeff Lyash, President and Chief Executive Officer, Ontario Power Generation, Mr. Michael Kobzar, Director, Sales Ontario, Siemens Canada Limited, Third Vice President, Empire Club of Canada, Mr. Mike Martelli, President, Renewable Generation and Power Marketing, Ontario Power Generation, Mr. Christopher Wine, Chief Executive Officer, Great Gulf Estate, and a Director of the Empire Club of Canada. Great Gulf has also invited with them today some students from the Master's Program at the University of Toronto and York Universities, and so we'll acknowledge the students as well. Dr. Gordon McIver, the past President of the Empire Club of Canada. The Honourable David Zimmer, Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, and Ms. M.J. Perry, PhD student, Theology, Vice President, and owner of Mr. Discount Limited, and a Director of the Empire Club of Canada. And my name is Barbara Jess, and I'm the President of Jesson and Company Communications and the President of the Empire Club of Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, your head table guests. We also have with us today the Minister of Natural Resources and Forestry, the Honourable Catherine McGarry. And Minister, thank you so much for joining us today. And now I'd like the students to rise and be recognized. Where are you, our student table? Welcome. We're delighted you could be with us today. Now, I've been told that our acoustics are not the best in the room today, and so I'm not going to be rude by not addressing the peripheral part of the audience, but I've been told if I speak straight ahead, you're going to hear me. And Mr. Martin has also asked me to make his apologies, that neither of us are trying to be rude, but we want you to hear. So some speakers need no introduction, and certainly the speaker that we have with us today is one of them. He's been with us before. And in fact, his father also spoke at the club many years ago, so we're very delighted to have you back, sir. The accomplishments of men like Mr. Martin and their contributions to this country run before them and say far more about their character than I can from this podium. Our distinguished guest today is perhaps our best example of this. All Canadians owe Paul Martin an enormous debt of gratitude. Mr. Martin was likely Canada's most successful finance minister ever. I remember very clearly when he took office. The books had not been properly balanced in Canada for nearly 40 years, and we had the highest annual deficits of any country in the G7. It's hard to imagine in these sunny days how low our international reputation had sunk. The Canadian pension plan was on its way to insolvency. Our credit ratings had been downgraded, and I can still recall newscasters likening the Canadian dollar to the Mexican peso on the nightly news. But along came Mr. Martin, who told us, come hell or high water, we're going to fix this. The path to get there would be arduous and take many painful years, but the country needed it. Few politicians would show the courage to take this long view to our finances, but Mr. Martin told us that if we wanted Canada to be successful and a competitive country, we needed a national reckoning. Whether we liked it or not, Mr. Martin was right. Reconciling years of poor policy was by no means easy, and I think we can all agree that it was necessary. Canada's deficit was erased, and I don't particularly recall that it was any hardship that we really experienced as we went through the process. The 5 years thereafter, we had a budget surplus and a declining national debt. In fact, I would argue that the economic prosperity that we enjoy today can draw a straight line back to the tough decisions made by Mr. Martin. Those in the room will likely know better than most that before heeding the call to public service, Mr. Martin enjoyed an enormous success in business. As the chairman and CEO of the CSL Group, he headed the world's largest self-unloading shipping company. Not only that, but when he purchased the company in 1981, it was hailed as the most important leveraged buyout in Canada. It was great interest then that I watched this lawyer, former shipping magnate, and undoubtedly one of the greatest economic minds of our time, take the reins as Prime Minister. He made one of his chief policy objectives bridging the gap between Canada's Indigenous peoples and the rest of the country. After generations of countless atrocities and broken promises, here was another courageous choice, and then one that was perhaps not the most obvious priority for a former finance minister. At the time, who could imagine that all the provinces, federal government, and the many Indigenous nations of this country would come together to agree in a single sweeping accord? And yet, in 2005, the Kelowna Accord was announced. It took a man of great foresight to stake his political future on an issue few wanted to touch. It took a man of even greater conviction to actually broker an agreement. Once again, Mr. Martin stood on the side of the right instead of the easy. He told Canadians a hard truth, that not only was it a true moral imperative, but with all too familiar language, that it was an economic imperative as well. It should come as no surprise, then, that Mr. Martin has unfinished business, that all Canadians have unfinished business. And though our former Prime Minister has been called to service again by the International Monetary Fund, the African Development Bank, the UN Economic Commission for Africa, and the Global Ocean Commission, he clearly feels that his true vocation is right here at home. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the 21st Prime Minister of Canada, the Right Honourable Paul Martin.
Well, thank you very much, Barbara, for that wonderful introduction. I've got a couple of speeches I've got to make next week. Would you like to come and introduce me? I also thank you for telling people that I've got to speak straight ahead, because if I can't look to the left and I can't look to the right, I don't want people to interpret that as a political move. I'm actually a little nervous. I went to the University of Toronto, and when I came to the University of Toronto in my very first year, my father spoke at the Empire Club, and he asked me to come. And it is a famous thing in our family that when my mother called to say, "How did your father do?" I said, "He spoke too long." And I'm a little worried that he's up there looking down and there's going to be a bolt of lightning that's going to come down if I go far too far. So I'm asking you to forgive me. We meet today, Barbara and I were talking on this, but this on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat. I can't help it. On the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the New Credit. These are acknowledgments that gain in purpose when I mention that I've been asked to speak to you by the Empire Club about the importance of Indigenous children of youth, and if you'll allow me to, I'll speak a little bit about MFI, which is my family's foundation, working in those issues. Now, am I here to talk to you about a problem? No, I'm not. I'm here to talk to you about an opportunity. But it begins with a problem, one going back to the European explorers who, after they figured out that this wasn't China or India, believed they discovered a new continent, one where no one of any consequence lived, despite the fact that there had been vibrant societies living here, educating, sharing, and trading since time immemorial. What made the problem worse was that from the start, the Europeans' message to North America's first peoples was the mantra used by colonial powers all over the world. We told them, and what was worse, we told ourselves, that everything we believed was good, and everything they believed, their history, their traditions, their culture, was irrelevant. And over time, because we imported disease and we had bigger guns, the ability of the first people to resist was weakened. However, they were stubborn, these Indigenous people, and because of their strength of will, our attempts to eradicate their culture failed, thank God. That being said, their resistance came at great cost, which can be seen today in the lives of so many Indigenous children, 50% of whom live below the poverty line. Now, after these opening remarks, the question you're going to be asking yourself, I suspect, is where is this opportunity you're talking about? And the answer, I believe, is it will come when we build the partnership that we should have built generations ago, a partnership that, as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission advocated, essentially gives Indigenous children a fair shake. And the question really is, how do we do that? So let me tell you a story. Children who cannot read or write by the end of grade 3 will have to play catch-up regardless of their school throughout their school years, and the odds are, if you look at the statistics, that they will never graduate from high school. Simply because if you can't read in grade 3, you get passed on to grade 4, you get passed on to grade 5, and you never learn how to do it. Faced with that reality, a number of years ago, the province of Ontario initiated a turnaround program designed to improve the literacy capacity of the 100 worst performing public primary schools here. It was a huge success. And after learning about it, on behalf of MFI, I went to see the Minister of Education, now Kathleen Wynne. I can say this to you, Minister Zimmer, Minister McGarry, so you can say thank you when you get back home. I asked her if I could learn the details of the program, and for the names of those who led its implementation, both of which she readily provided. And not long thereafter, in order to see how it could be adapted, we introduced the program into 2 on-reserve schools in southwestern Ontario. How do we do? Well, the best way to put it to you is before the pilot program began, only 13% of the students at the 2 on-reserve schools that we went into could read and write by the end of grade 3. This compared to 70% in Ontario's public schools who could read at the Ontario standard. At the end of our project, 5 years later, 81% of the grade 3 students in those 2 on-reserve schools had attained the provincial standard. They could read and write, and they read and write at a level that far surpassed the provincial average. These were spectacular outcomes. And as a result, with the support of the federal government, we're now implementing the program in 6 schools, and we will be by 2020 in 20 schools across the country, and hopefully the program will continue. Now, clearly, those numbers speak volumes, but what spoke even louder was what the chief of Kettle and Stony Point, which is one of the reserves where one of the pilot schools were, and what he said when the results were announced. He defined better than anybody I have ever heard since the demise of the Kelowna Accord, which Barbara referred to. What he talked about was the potential for the partnership that was required between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. And what happened was a very large, big man stood up before everybody when the announcement was made, and the tears were rolling down his cheeks. And he said to the assembled crowd, "You didn't think they could do it, but look at what our kids can do when they're given the tools to do the job." And ladies and gentlemen, that is what the partnership we need requires. The First Nations, the Métis Nation, and the Inuit will do what has to be done. Our responsibilities as Canadians is to ensure that they have the tools to do the job. Our role is to walk the path with Indigenous parents in their communities as they seek the best for their children. Let me give you a couple of other examples of what I mean. Imagine yourselves as the principal in a Northern Reserve school. Imagine what it's like. You have no school board to back you up. You have no Ministry of Education to back you up because Ottawa doesn't have a Department of Education. There is no other principal within 200 kilometers to talk to, and you may have received very little training for the job. It was to help to fill this gap that MFI created the principals course. We brought in 13 expert educators from across the country. We brought them to the University of Toronto's Faculty of Education. For over a year and a half, working in partnership with OISE, they built the curriculum from the ground up. And the program is now in its third year, teaching Indigenous principals and those who want to be online across Canada. Those who've taken the course will tell you that the content is there. They'll tell you that the standards are extremely high. But most importantly, they will tell you that it's a course that is not designed for big city schools. They will tell you that it's a course designed for the reality that those principals face in these northern schools, confirming that education must be empowered from inside a school where it counts most. Another example of providing the tools Indigenous Canada is talking for can be found in the Aboriginal Youth Entrepreneurship Program. The president of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, J.P. Gladue, is here. We're talking about the kinds of people that are part of his organization today, but we're talking about them when they were students. Through no fault of their own, many Indigenous communities have been shut out of active participation in the economy and the opportunity that that provides. The collateral damage falling from this is a lack of work experience and skills development among young people that feeds upon itself, inhibiting their resilience and their self-confidence. And it comes down to self-confidence. Think about it. Think about it when you're a 15, a 16-year-old kid, and you're asked, you know, the question all of us ask, the dumb question, what do you want to be when you grow up? And you've never seen a business. You don't know anything about business. Why in God's name would you pick business? And then we come along and we say, well, why is it 85% unemployment on some of these communities? It's because there's never been a business course taught in any high school, Aboriginal high school. We've got one now, and it's working marvelously well. And in fact, we created an accredited high school course with the goal of teaching Indigenous students the elements of business, everything from marketing to accounting, from how to raise money to how to close a sale. We started at a First Nations school in Northern Ontario, serving small fly-in communities of anywhere from 100 to 300 people down the shores of Hudson's Bay. We're now in some 42 schools across Canada. And at their request, we're now expanding into adult education centers. And that was at their request. Why has the course succeeded? Well, I'll tell you the story, and I don't look very good in this. But one reason is about 2 years after we got the course going, it's been going now for 6 or 7 years, a young OG Cree student asked me why we didn't have more Indigenous examples and the role models in the program. In fact, what he said to me was, Mr. Martin, you know that this is a course for Indigenous students, and you know that most of us live in communities of anywhere from 300 to 1,000 people. How come every one of your examples is in Montreal, Toronto, or Vancouver? And I looked at him and I suddenly realized, boy, are you a dope. And so I said that first. As a result, working with Nelson Publishing, we produced the first set of high school business workbooks and textbooks ever written for Indigenous students, by Indigenous teachers, about Indigenous entrepreneurs in Indigenous communities, and it made all the difference. And in fact, we're now sending these books to New Zealand, to Australia, and it's a wonderful, wonderful success story. And these kids are really doing well. In other words, if what you want to do, give them a chance to learn. Give them a chance to learn within the context and the culture that they're familiar with. And if you want them to build businesses in their communities, then teach them how when they're young and ready to take on the world. In the same vein, we've established a relationship with the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada that led to the creation of a highly successful mentorship program, which they are running. We've reached out to the law firms. Weir Folds is here. They've been with us from the very beginning. And in fact, now we've also begun a mentoring program with McCarthy Tetro that we hope to see expanded in the profession. all of this building on our relationships. Why is this so important? It's because mentorship is partnership at its most personal. Now, so far, I've been talking to you about the tools required to play catch-up, and we will continue to need these tools. But the questions that Indigenous communities are now asking us is, how will we stop having to play catch-up? And what, to cite a prominent First Nations advocate, a woman by the name of Cindy Blackstock, many of you have heard of, who said, what if the next generation of Indigenous children was the generation that didn't have to recover from their childhoods? What if they were able to break the cycle altogether? Is this possible? Yes, it is, provided that we as a society are prepared to invest in families and their well-being so that parents can build up the identity, the resiliency, and the belonging that they seek for their children. We know that the single most important factor in a child's early development is a stable and committed relationship with a parent, a caregiver, or another adult from birth. And if this is absent, then the consequences will be felt throughout that child's early life and far into adulthood. Now, the scientists, in fact, all confirm this today, but mothers have known it since the beginning of time. The 9 months of pregnancy and the early years of a child's life are the most critical period in shaping the fundamental structures, the functions of the brain. And getting things right for the first time is a lot better than trying to fix them in later life. Now, why am I telling you all this? I'm not telling you because you don't know. You all do, and in fact, I can see the women are shaking their heads positively. The men are probably questioning me. But I'm telling you this not because you don't know it. I'm telling you really because it provides the basis for a new program that we have been working on for a year and a half that I'd like to talk to you about. It's a program that originally rose out of a conversation with an elder who raised a critical role that parents and communities play when we were down there talking to them about our business course one day. The elder, we got into a discussion of what the scientists have said, what the mothers had said, and then the elder stopped all of us and just said, wait a minute, you think you're telling us? We knew this. We did this. We have this knowledge. Our traditional way is the family and the community raises the child. But that was taken away from us by the residential schools. What that elder was confirming, that the Indigenous communities know what is best for their children. They know what their children need. They know what is best for their children's well-being. But they also understand that they have to have the support that is required to reestablish those ways after all of those years of residential schools. And that's what our new program is all about. To develop it, we consulted with Indigenous communities from coast to coast to coast, and we discussed it with Indigenous and non-Indigenous experts, health education, child welfare experts across the land. And together with them, we developed a 5-year project which focuses on fostering healthy development in the critical age of pregnancy to age 5. The program trains home visitors from the community, only from the community, and then asks them to pair with all of the expecting mothers in the community who are living there, beginning with their pregnancy and up to the age of 2. And then the mothers will also participate in weekly talking circles, providing peer support, facilitated by the home visitors and various experts who will be invited to speak. You know, I don't know, and I'm sure it's the same thing in your families, but what happens right now is so many of these young mothers are just left alone, kept to their own. There is no basically interchange. I have got 3 daughters-in-law, 2 of them with a number of children, and what they all told me is I say to you, you see your college friends, and they say, no, all of our friends are the mothers of our children, and that's where we meet them all, and this is what happens. Well, why does it take a genius to understand that the same thing is going to happen within a community? And so we've set up these talking circles, facilitated by the home visitors, and bringing experts to speak to them. And at the age of 2, each child will then move to a play-based curriculum, a play-based curriculum and a preschool-driven curriculum. And the home visiting component will continue for another 2 years. So they'll be there right up, essentially, till when the child turns 5. By better resourcing new moms and dads and their families, clearly we hope to see an improvement in child development. But we also hope to dramatically decrease the number of child welfare apprehensions, particularly at birth. Too often, the current system that is sets up Indigenous families for failures, before their children are even born. And the consequence of that is that almost 50% of the Canadian children, who find themselves in foster homes today, are Indigenous. And remember, Indigenous Canadians are 4% of the population, and they're furnishing 50% of all the kids, and in some provinces, by the way, that number goes up to 60 and 70 and 80%. The reason for this can be as simple as unfair as a mother's poverty. Now you think about it. Mother loses her child because she simply doesn't have the money to sustain that child. This goes against everything that we as Canadians say that we stand for. Because of this, home visitors will work with all families in the community with new babies, and in this way the home visitors hopefully will be positioned to offer supports to parents that hopefully will prevent family dysfunction, helping them navigate their way through crises, and where necessary, advocating on their behalf. The home visitors approach seeks to support new parents and children from every possible angle. Thus, what we hope is that the program will provide a platform on which communities can build other initiatives as well, all seeking to help a child fulfill its dreams. A platform that puts children at the center, that gives community services the chance to work together. A platform that can be scaled up in Indigenous communities right across the land, meeting family needs wherever they are. Because giving Indigenous children a good start in life should be a given in Canada. Now, so far, what I have tried to do in these remarks is to respond to the Empire Club's request to tell you a bit of what we're doing. History has shown that the First Nations, the Métis Nation, and the Inuit know better than anyone what their children's needs are. As Canadians, our responsibility, as I mentioned, is essentially to ensure that they have the tools to do the job. This is what motivates MFI, and it motivates our allies. However, none of this will bear fruit unless the partnership between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples is alive and well. And that's why I was so glad to accept your invitation to come here. And the fact is that there are so many of you here on this issue. I'm not sure that would have happened 5 years ago, and I think it's wonderful that we are here and that you're being so patient in listening to me. But none of this is going to work, A, unless the partnership between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians is alive and well, nor will it work unless governments at all levels play a strong and positive role. And in that context, the one of governments, I'd ask you to bear with me as I make a few final comments. Having been at government, this is where the two ministers are going to start to say, oh my God, what's he going to say? But let me just simply say, I'd like to touch on the decision by the federal government 3 months ago to divide the INAC, the Department of Indigenous Affairs, into 2 separate ministries, which in my opinion makes enormous sense. This because, quite simply, although we have finally recognized the unfairness of our treatment of Indigenous peoples, we continue to expect them to overcome the issues they face without the necessary resources to succeed. And what is now required is a new understanding in which Indigenous peoples regain control over their future, an understanding based on cultural respect and proper funding. And that's why the creation of the two new ministers is so important. That's why at the helm of each is a very, very strong minister. Dr. Carolyn Bennett at Indigenous Relations, and Dr. Jane Philpott, who assumes the responsibility for Indigenous Services, and I'm sure you know both of them, being they are both Toronto ministers. As the elder in the story that I recounted to you earlier, as that elder said, Indigenous communities do have the knowledge required to determine what is the best thing for their children. But that has to be reflected in the issues in governance. It has to be reflected, first of all, in the transition out of the Indian Act, which is probably the worst piece of legislation that was ever written anytime, anywhere, and that has lasted since 1876. My God. Anyway, but it also has to be reflection, I say, in the transition out of the Indian Act into a relationship that fully incorporates the inherent right of self-government, of self-determination, one that will enable Indigenous communities and families to regain control over their children's future, and this is one of Minister Bennett's prime responsibilities. In Minister Philpott's case, while the residential schools have been justifiably blamed for the terrible things they did, I'll tell you there's something else that all of us in this room should understand. And that is, while the residential schools are taking all the blame, over the last 60 years, as we began to phase out the residential schools, the underfunding of on-reserve education, on-reserve health care, on-reserve child welfare, clean water and housing, that underfunding since the 1960s has led to massive damage in Indigenous communities across the country. And our generation cannot walk away from that. It's enough. You can blame the residential schools, but take a look at what we have not done and what we should have done. How in heaven's name did we justify that child A was going to get all that money and child B wasn't going to get anything? This is what we sought to address in the Kelowna Accord. And this is the greatest challenge Minister Philpott has inherited. What staggers the mind is that there are still those who today would argue that we cannot afford to provide Indigenous children with the same health and education that other children have. That is morally repugnant beyond belief goes without saying, but it is also economic nonsense. And I speak this as if somebody had spent some time there. The fact is, the cost of teaching Indigenous children to read and write, to add and subtract, to speak their own languages, to learn their own culture, to grow up confident in their own identity, is nothing compared to the social and economic cost of illiteracy, of pandemic suicide, of drug abuse and incarceration. In a report commissioned by the Margaret and Wallace McCain Family Foundation, the Conference Board of Canada recently estimated that every dollar spent on early learning pays for itself 6 times over. That number should not surprise you. As Barbara mentioned, I spent a bit of time in the Department of Finance, not exactly sort of a locale of compassion and generosity, but the fact of the matter is there isn't an official in the Department of Finance who wouldn't essentially tell you that there are few returns on investment in government as high as those which come from education. And clearly there can be no better investment than in any child's education, health, and well-being, whether they be Indigenous or not, except that when it comes to Indigenous children, the payback from eliminating the existing gaps becomes even greater. For the first time in history, there are more people in our country over the age of 65 than there are under the age of 15. The fastest growing segment of that young population is Indigenous. In a recent report published by the Centre for Living Standards, co-authored by Don Drummond, who is an official terrier with you and I in the Department of Finance, it is predicted that Indigenous people, who represent, as I said earlier, just 4% of our population, could contribute as much as 20% of the growth in Canada's workforce, provided that the education gap, which currently exists between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, is bridged. And if that isn't enough, just ask yourself, what the consequences will be if our country, with an aging population of only 34 million people, in a world of huge technological change, undereducates the fastest growing segment of our population. What all this means, in my opinion, is that Minister Philpott may be the minister responsible for social services, but she is also an economic minister of the highest order. It is her department that will provide this country with the highest payback of anything on which government can spend money on. And so in summary, if Canada is to be successful, then young Indigenous people must have the opportunity to take their rightful place in the economic life of the nation. A nation that should not only welcome their participation, but in fact needs their contribution as tomorrow's workers, as tomorrow's scientists, teachers, academic, business leaders, entrepreneurs, and if you're forgive me saying so, maybe even the odd politician. But equally important, Indigenous youth must see a picture, must see a future that is grounded in the rich traditions and the deeply held values of their people. And here the works of Minister Philpott and Minister Bennett really complement each other. As a country, we have a future to deliver. Promises inscribed on the parchment of treaties and in the words of the Constitution, but also etched in the hearts of so many Indigenous youth who ask not only to succeed, but they ask to be understood. They ask that as we ask them to understand our culture. They ask us to understand theirs. And when you begin to do it, it's an incredibly rich culture. There is an enormous amount to learn, and we should do it. Surely to God, we won't make the same mistake that the early settlers made, which was to dismiss Indigenous thought out of hand. For the fact is that we understand, if we understand and we respect the richness of the Indigenous worldview, then we will provide one of the tools that is so crucial to young Indigenous people if they're going to live in both cultures. In short, ladies and gentlemen, the time has come for us as Canadians to start listening and working together. Thank you very much.
Mr. Martin has agreed to take some questions from the audience. There are microphones placed about the room, and there's one back here and one over here. Questions?
I've got one here.
Great.
Mr. Martin, you mentioned business as being an important part. You mentioned business being an important part of this equation. What is your thoughts on Canadian business and their role in Indigenous education, period?
J.P. Gladue is the head of the Canadian Council for Native Business and has spent most of his life on this issue. An interesting thing for many of you who would have known Murray Koffler, who was the founder of Shoppers Drug Mart, who was really the founder of the Canadian Council. There is no doubt that Canadian business can play the key role. Can play the key role in many ways. Obviously, in understanding Canadian business, which is in the extractive industries, understanding, in fact, what is going on there, making sure that the consultation is full. But there's an enormous amount more that's happening where I think business has got to play a role. I will give you two. One of the ways that you are working on very much, which is the question of internships. I think that internships are absolutely crucial. We know it in the life of ordinary Canadians. We know the importance of internships. And so it seems to me that internships in the case of First Nations, Métis Nation, and Inuit is all the more important. The second thing that I would say to you is that more and more we are now seeing, and I think with properly, that business and the education community is beginning to understand that they're going to start teaching coding in grade 1, that we're going to start teaching STEM in primary school, and that there is going to be, I think, a fundamental revolution in a great deal of what happens in terms of primary and secondary school education. My biggest fear is that in fact that will take care in the public schools here in Toronto, and it will not take care in the on-reserve schools up in Northern Ontario, as an example. And I think that what business has got to say is to understand that, that in fact, fundamentally, that goes back to the youngest and the fastest growing segment of your population. If what you do is to simply say that STEM and higher math and all of these kinds of things that are going to be taught in these other areas are going to be important for my business, but I'm going to draw from a smaller segment of the young population, it's not going to work. So I think it's in Canada's interest, I think it's in business interest, but I also think that it's the right thing to do.
Mr. Martin, I will probably be throwing the cat amongst the canaries, and I apologize in advance. As someone of settler heritage who is committed to reconciliation in my small way, I was struck by two of your phrases. One was not to dismiss Indigenous thought, and the other was we need to give the tools. As we are getting more into 3P types of things and needing to hear voices, I'm thinking also of my generation as we help train children. My generation needs to hear what is going on and why and the history. And yet, the hardest place events of any kind, be they award events, be they speeches, be they fundraisers, to find sponsorship is when it involves Indigenous people representing themselves and coming forward with ideas. And I do it all the time, and I never have, that's the one area where I have difficulty. What do we do to encourage the sponsorship of events in which Indigenous people can represent themselves?
Now, are you talking about sponsorship?
Speakers, one was an award event, actually two award events, one for Roberta Jameson and Marie Wilson, and the other was for Stan McKay and Cindy Blackstock. Speeches here at the Empire Club. Various events. It's finding sponsorship when Indigenous people represent themselves that I'm always having difficulty with.
I understand. I understand what you're saying and the difficulty. Again, I don't want to keep referring to JP, but the fact of the matter is the business community can be represented and is represented, and there are a number of outstanding Indigenous business people in the country. Darcy Bear, Clarence Louie, I can give you the names. Now, to be honest, it's not going to be easy for you to get them to come and speak. A lot of businessmen are hard to come to get to speak. I suspect that Gord, you've had trouble, or Barbara, you've had trouble to get.
Wait a long time for you.
Yeah, well, there you go. Well, it was because of my father. But I will tell you something that is interesting. When we decided that we were going to do this most recent program, the early childhood, there are in the faculties of the higher education across the country, in the public policy schools, you would be amazed at the number of Indigenous people who are there. There are, in terms of education, in terms of health care, Michael Dan, who is here, could speak to this. He's at the university. Oh. Oh, you're not talking. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So you're saying you're getting businesses to pay for it? That surprises me. I mean, you know, Ontario Power does it. I think what you just got to do is blackmail them. I'm actually surprised that you have trouble getting the businesses. I think that a lot of us would be prepared to help you with that, because that just doesn't make any sense to me. If there's anybody who should be prepared to sponsor those kinds of events, it should be the business community, who they're the ones that will gain from it. And I think the fact that you raised that here, I think, is going to cause a lot of twinges of. There you go. Okay.
One more.
Bonjour, Nimi Uncle Quay, Nadish Cause, Deshkan Zibing, Nadojaba, Maingan Nadodem, and Nishnabe Ojibwe Quay and Dow. My name is Leslie Whiteeye. I'm the former chief of Chippewas of the Thames First Nation and an educator by career. Your messaging has always I appreciate the work you're doing, Mr. Martin. It's incredible in terms of your advocacy and your championing the work that has to be done in our communities. The challenge, I think, is where does the message start to change? And is it no longer just the past in terms of a settler approach that was racist? When do we call upon what's happening now? Is this ignorance? Is this complacency? To answer the question that was asked here, it's a question for the larger group here. What is it that's going to compel you to work and figure out the complex issues together? Because I don't know that, I certainly don't want to sit and listen over and over again about the ills of my community. If that's what compels you to move, I don't want to be a part of that. What's gonna compel you to move?
I think your question is dead on, which is why I made the reference to Jane Philpott, not as a social affairs minister, but as an economic minister. The fact of the matter is, if we know what's good for us, we are going to invest in First Nations education. We know what is good for us, we are going to invest in First Nations communities, because this is where the young people are going to come from. If we are going to succeed, we're going to make sure that those schools up in Northern Ontario are learning coding at the same time that they're learning coding in the schools down here. I'll tell it is I think you can make I think the moral argument is overwhelming, and I think everybody and you do too. But the economic argument is overwhelming. And I believe, for exactly the reason that you've given, that the argument has got to switch to the economic argument, because that's the one that is impossible to ignore. It's impossible to, look at, I mean, when somebody comes along, just take 30 more seconds, when somebody comes along and sort of says, we can't afford it, it's too much money, because that's what you're hearing in the odd place. Think about it. At the time that
job skills training, apprenticeships, and internships to those community members, and perhaps most importantly, we have these First Nations as long-term equity partners in those facilities. They are co-owners with us, and they benefit from a revenue stream that will go decades into the future. And I share that because I think those were opportunities that took very hard work to realize, but we realized them through partnership, and they're benefiting those communities, the company, and all of you, Ontarians, as shareholders. Your remarks were inspirational, and they laid a challenge in front of us that I think is well worth taking up. So for that, thank you, and a job well done.
A sincere thank you to our generous sponsors, Ontario Power Generation and Nova Chemicals, for making this event possible. As MJ alluded to so eloquently, sponsorship really is at the core of what we do here at the Empire Club. We think we bring important issues before Canadians, but we do need your support to do it, and so we're profoundly grateful. Thank you so much. We would like to thank MediaEvents.ca, Canada's online event space, for webcasting today's event for thousands of viewers around the world. We have tried to stay current at the Empire Club, although we've been around since 1903. You can follow us on Twitter at Empire_Club and visit us online at www.empireclub.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Finally, please join us at our next event on December the 11th with Patrick Brown, the leader of the Ontario PC Party, at the Arcadian Court. Thank you so much for being with us today, and this meeting is now adjourned.